Hello and welcome back to our series about the Scopes trial. Last time we talked about the media and the public perception around the Scopes trial, touching on, for example, Inherit the Wind and some of the other media effects around that trial and the way that it was dramatized. This time we want to talk some about the aftermath and legacy of the trial, specifically about the ruling itself and its long-term consequences, some of the evolution, if you could say it that way, in the evolution versus intelligent design debate in modern education policy, and some reflections on how this conversation has evolved in the past century. And I would say even over the past few years, we've had some evolution on this subject. So just to start off, either Jordan or Jace, either one of you can jump in here. Tell me a little bit about some of the long-term consequences of the ruling of the Scopes trial, and not just the ruling itself, but the way it was portrayed and the general
Well, I
consequences
just
of the
want to
trial.
start by saying
I
that
think you first.
one of the largest consequences of this is the fact that you said evolution about 6 times, and I got very triggered. But no, all jokes aside, I do think that that started a long term friction between science and religion, and it has effectively pushed any element of religion out of public education, and not just public education, out of the media, out of most of modern culture, as far as elements that make decision. Any kind of institution, generally outside of a religious institution, is not going to have any kind of religious elements. And it's very much secularized our society, secularized our culture in a very strong way, I think. And like I said before, that doesn't necessarily start with just the Scopes trial, but everything that led to the Scopes trial and everything that funneled through the Scopes trial, I think, has led to this very strict, removal and as Jay said earlier, divorce from religion and society as a whole, or just secular culture. And I think it's become in many ways, very problematic, because it almost seems as though it almost seems laughable, the degree to which we've gone to separate them. But even now in modern culture, I'd say that most, even American Christians, I wouldn't say all, but most American Christians would even say, yeah, we can't have religion in schools. Yeah, we shouldn't have religion in schools because that's not what the Constitution wants. Or no, we can't talk about religion in schools. That's not right. They would make that stance. They would agree with that stance. Now, I think that's a massive divergence from where things were 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think that for me, the place that I see the most impact in this trial is with the way that it, I guess, led to a lot of religious society pulling back and pulling away from secular society, and they started building a lot of their own private religious universities. You see the creation of things like the ICR by Henry Morris. I'm pretty sure that's what he made. You see, today we'll see groups like Answers in Genesis. We'll see things like the Creation Museum. We'll see this idea of intelligent design. And what I think is most striking is all of these groups that claim to be scientific and be giving scientific evidence to some length or another are typically using their experts and their data and their scientists instead of the peer-reviewed journals or secular scientists. And now it's not even that we're just separating ourselves culturally, but we're working with an entire different set of facts and framework and logic and reason, and there's no way to even have a good dialogue at this point. There's groups that are trying to overcome that. You can see that with groups like Biologos, or I think the Faraday... I don't remember the full name of that group, but there's a couple of groups that are really trying to address this and overcome that divide. But the way that the media portrayed religious institutions really led to a lot of religious society saying, all right, if you're going to treat us that way, then we're just going to pull back away from you. I mean, it's no different really than what happened with Qumran, right? There's a group that just pulled away from the rest because they were tired of being overlooked or made fun of or whatever else, so they started making their own society, and that's what we see today. We have secular America and we have religious America, and the two circles don't mix.
And
And
when you refer to Qumran, you're referring to the community near the Dead Sea where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, thought to be perhaps an Essene community, being a sort of mystical flavor of an ancient Jewish sect. Is that right?
yes, yeah, I guess I could have defined that a little bit better.
No, you're
Um,
good.
but yeah, it's all I'm really pointing out is that it's not a new idea. When there's a group that has a view that is the minority view, or even just perceived as the minority view, they tend to pull away, and so that's what happens. And because science stayed in the secular circle, and all the religious people pulled away from that, suddenly the secularists had full free reign of science and got to shape what all the frameworks were, what all of the dialogue was, how things were said, how phrases were allowed to be given. And now, I think in maybe the past half a century, but especially within the last 30 years, I think that the religious side of America has really seen that as a mistake, and we're trying to come back into science. Like, I don't feel weird being a scientist and being a Christian, but maybe 40 years ago that would have been unthinkable. And it's really hard to enter back into there because, I mean, like Jordan's pointed out, now it's to the point where you're not even supposed to bring up the idea of God because that's just so inherently anti-science, and there's no place for that within modern science and research. So that's where I see the biggest effect on it.
No, and I think that's a great point. And I think also you're highlighting something, you're both highlighting something that's really important here, which is that there has been this significant retreat of, I would say, directly theistic ideas in public discourse from the time of the 1920s through the near modern day, where it used to be very common to talk about God or theism generally in schools or in a courtroom or in a scientific context, really anywhere. Whereas today, you don't see that as much. But there's been a bit of a reversal, I would argue, over the last few years, maybe the last couple of decades, where we are starting to see somewhat of a resurgence. And some of that, I would argue, has been good and some of that bad, as with all things. But it's been interesting to me to see the ways in which the discussion has begun to get a little bit more nuanced than it used to be in terms of, science good, religion bad, and the two don't mix. Today, I don't think we're seeing quite that dichotomy in scientific context and philosophical circles, really anywhere. Any
I
thoughts on
have a
that?
thought on that.
I mean,
Mostly from the element that you talk about more recently. There seems to be this convergence back to a more nuanced view that includes the element of talking about religion. I think that what we talked about earlier when we talked about the media aspect was that for a long time the narrative was dominated and set by whatever institution had the largest voice, whether that be journalists at a particular paper or radio programs or whatever it may be. Those who had access to speak to the most people got to set the narrative, and that didn't change until the last decade, really, because the narrative from the media was absolutely set, and whatever that we have five major media networks in the U.S. and all of them pretty much, I mean, they vary a little bit, but mostly on the same page as far as a lot of things that they discuss. And so they very much set the narrative, and then social media came along, and social media allowed anybody to have a voice. And for a while, even that was being directed and even that was being censored. But now a lot of social media is breaking away from that, and we're actually getting to see people's real voice. Like, now that we're actually getting to see how people really feel and how they really respond, that shaping and that control from the media, which they've had for over a century now in America, is really starting to fall apart. And I think, like you said, Brett, for good or for bad, that's allowing people to really have a more nuanced conversation about, well, this is what I think, this is what I feel, and it's not that uncommon to feel this way. Those who are in a bubble might think that it's uncommon or that it's uncouth or that it's wrong. But truthfully speaking, by and large, I think most people can agree. Like, most people in the U.S. are Christians. Most people in the U.S. believe in science. So how could we possibly say that the two are completely at odds if most people agree with them, right? And so this dichotomy is kind of, I think, in many ways starting to fall apart because we are getting to actually to speak past that veil that was the mainstream media.
One place where I've seen this change in an especially pronounced way, this sound like an odd place for me to talk about, but that would be in atheist movements. Because as much as I am not an atheist, I have spent an odd amount of time listening to their material, specifically in a philosophical context. So you had the new atheist movement over the last couple of decades with Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchin, who wrote God is Not Great, Sam Harris, The End of Faith, and Daniel Dennett writing Breaking the Spell. And their perspective was essentially the same perspective that we see from Darrow, that Christianity is anti-intellectual. For the most part, I'm painting with a broad brush, but the general tenor of the New Atheist movement was that Christianity and all religion is anti-intellectual, and if you want to be a smart, scientific, intelligent member of society, you need to let go of your primitive faith, right? This has been largely gotten rid of, and it's to the point where we deride people who fit into the stereotype. You know, you might picture the new atheist wearing a fedora who's always getting in arguments, right? We have stereotypes about these people, and frankly, we make fun of them in common discourse. And now the modern philosophical speakers in these circles are people more like Alex O'Connor or Joe Foley from Cosmic Skeptic and Unsolicited Advice. Both of them, while being atheist or agnostic speakers with leanings toward atheism, they're both very, at least fair towards theistic arguments. They will be quick to admit when theism has a point or when theism has a stronger position for one issue. And I don't think we saw that in the atheist movement 20 years ago at all. And the same thing's happening on the Christian side. I would argue that it is easier as a Christian to walk into a church and to say, hey, the problem of evil is really hard. Like, at least for me, for hypothetically, someone might say, at least for me, I think this is really challenging, and I have a difficult time with this idea of how could a perfectly good God allow evil in the world? Like, this really hurts. Let's work through this. In a way where before the conversation would have been, no, God is good, let's not talk about that, you know, everything's fine, right? And I think we're starting to see those walls break down on both sides.
Yeah. Maybe a good place I can illustrate this is the fact that I can go into the lab that I work in. We have Christians, we have atheists, we have agnostics, we have whatever. And we can talk about philosophy. Like, a few weeks ago, we discussed essentially what's the strongest explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe, and whether or not a designer was a reasonable hypothesis. We've discussed whether or not morality is objective or subjective, and if it is objective, then what is that objective actually grounded in? And it's not like we get into a big fight about it. We have these different perspectives. I'm not sure if any opinions are really changed at the end of the day, but we can have these discussions even in a science lab, a very, traditionally at least within the last 100 years, secular area, and just have these conversations and be friends. Like, that's extremely normal now, it seems. And so I think that really exemplifies exactly what you're saying, is we've gotten rid of kind of this new atheist movement. We're no longer, it's the Christians and the atheists that are fighting each other in an all-out war and there's bloodshed and stuff everywhere. No, at the end of the day, it's just two different philosophies. Now, we strongly believe that our philosophy is offering something that no other philosophy can do, which is the idea that you can have eternal life in a relationship with your Creator in a more fulfilling way than anything that we could even imagine on this earth. And we want to bring everybody into that. So we have a reason for wanting to spread that view. But at the same time, I don't think any of us are taking Brian's position or Billy Sunday's position where it's all hellfire and brimstone and be a Christian or else you're going to burn. That's not really the tenor that's happening within Christianity today either. So I think that the temperature of the whole debate has been toned down. And I think, Jordan, you're absolutely right. A lot of this has to do with the influence of social media and how more people have a voice now. Like, the fact that we're talking right now and putting this on... Oh, okay. Two of us at least have a voice.
Technical difficulties. Continue.
The fact that we're talking right now and having this conversation and it's getting posted on the internet where anybody in the world with access can access it, like, that's not something that would have been happening in 1925. And I have to wonder, if social media had been around in 1925, how much would that have actually changed the conversation? Because I don't think that it would have been the same thing we saw 100 years ago.
Right, I think you're right. And just to push back on, well, I think actually not push back, just to clarify one point, I think. You had commented how for most Christians it's not this idea that, be a Christian or you're going to burn in hell. I would argue that for the majority of Christians, at least in the United States, they would hold the position that
Sorry,
if
yeah,
you
I'm not saying positionally. I'm
but
saying in tone.
that's not what they lead with.
Yeah, it's not.
That's not the narrative discourse that is pervading a
Yeah.
society.
Who
Is
was it?
join us
Who
or
was the
burn.
big preacher that went around and was kind of famous for the hellfire and brimstone type thing? Billy Sunday did do kind of a lot of this hellfire and brimstone preaching. He was around, I think, 1862 through 1935, and he actually played a huge role in the publicity leading up to both the passing of the Butler Act and the Scopes trial itself. Like, he typically wouldn't stop in the same town or sometimes even state multiple years in a row in order to try and diversify things a bit. But he came back to Tennessee over and over again before the final vote on the Butler Act. He did the same thing, as I understand it, before the Scopes trial. And that was kind of his preaching style. As he was energetic, he would pace around, he would shout, he would punch the air, he would give all of these enigmatic gestures. He would use this vivid language to talk about how awful the things were that he disagreed with. Like, I think he called evolution that atheistic bastard theory or something like that. And so that's kind of the tone of at least some branches of Christianity at that time. And I think for the most part that's gone away today.
I do think we have a small and vocal sect that still speaks that way, but
Sure.
it is far from the main tenor of Christian thought and
Yeah.
discourse
But
versus
like, when's
that
the last
actually
time
was.
you've actually seen Westboro Baptist Church in the news?
It's been a while. And in
Right?
fairness, even when I did see them in the news, they were not portrayed positively.
No, no. I think Kingsman did quite the number to them too.
That they did. So Jordan, I was going to ask you, you mentioned having a background in education. How do you think a lot of these changes have affected modern education policy? I talked about it a bit from a legal perspective, but I'd like to hear it a little bit more just from the perspective of an educator, not some stodgy lawyer in an ivory tower.
Right, as because you haven't gone through any kind of education or anything. Um,
Only in ivory towers.
only in ivory towers.
I think they were
Um,
burnt orange towers, actually.
Yes, they were burnt orange. But
burnt
proceed.
orange towers. They weren't burnt enough. Anyway,
Oof.
sorry, that was
Speaking of sinners in the hands of an angry God, please continue.
yes, exactly.
Oh, I was thinking of the
Anyway,
A&M
let's talk
fight
about
song
the
that actually has a
educational
part
element.
about burning the city of Austin to the ground.
That's
Yeah.
fair. That is in there.
To talk a little bit about education, the education perspective of it, I think that I always ask myself, what should education be, right? And I think that most good educators, and I think that I would put more than 50% of educators in the good educator category because, I've just seen too many good teachers. The problem with public education is not the educators generally speaking. It's a lot of the administration and the rules that are put around that. So much power has been put into the hands of the state to determine how education should develop. And I think that some element of that stemmed from that time, stemmed from the 1920s and the Scopes trial because, originally the thought was we should teach truth. And if that's the basis, right? And that's my philosophy is how should you educate? You should teach the truth, and that's how you should educate. And so, if as a nation or as a state or as a society, we've chosen to believe in the truth, that is that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. We choose to believe the truth that God created the heavens and the earth, and then that's the fundamental basis for what we believe as a society or even as just a community. Then the next step going into how we educate should be based on that, right? And that's not trying to force things down people's throat, but like if it's not the truth, we at least need to have a framework, at least need to have a place where we can have that conversation, right? School is no longer the place where we debate on what truth is. It's no longer the place where we discuss what truth is. Truth has become irrelevant in the classroom in many ways. Truth is determined by what textbook is being lobbied to the state government to deploy into all the public spaces. Um, and in many ways, I think that that's become incredibly problematic. And it's not just, yes, there is an element to which religion has been removed, but if religion is removed, then what becomes the standard? What do we educate? What do we teach? Because yes, you can teach the science, but the science is only one half of things, and I think that's the problem we ran into with that dichotomy. Is by making that separation, especially on the education scale, was to say that we no longer need to discuss there's no need to discuss the meaning behind that. There's no need to discuss the fundamental aspects of our existence or of truth or of any of those things, because the only thing that matters is what we put in the textbook and what you write down on the test. It has nothing to do with how you learn or how you think or what your views may be. Education can't really effectively work outside of determining the why to the what. But we have, by separating religion and science, we've done exactly that. We've removed the ability to properly educate our society. And it's not just saying that, well, we have to teach Christianity. Again, I go back to, if we agree that it's true, then we should teach it. But if we are open to the concept, and I think nowadays we are, as you pointed out, then we should at least have a place where we can have that discourse. And it should be the education system. But there's not a single soul alive. I don't know. I'm not talking about alive, but like 90% of people in the education system right now aren't equipped to handle education in that setting. And most of the time in those settings, the kids couldn't handle that. Those who are being educated or in higher education, when you get into college or upper level education, they're not equipped to have those conversations. Because for so long those things have been separated, and it's a huge taboo issue. You can't even, so people don't even know how to have that conversation anymore. Mm-hmm. People don't know how to have that talk.
Yeah,
and
I
so
think it's funny.
I think that from the public education policy perspective, that what I classify as a misinterpretation of the Establishment Clause has in many ways fundamentally ruined what education should be. If I sound passionate about it, it's because I am. But that's and that may be a bit of a strong stance, right? Because you also don't want it to become a bastion of the state dictating how people what people believe theologically. But I don't think even in that time that's really what that was in the education system. I think it was an opportunity for people to be willing to discuss it, be able to discuss it, but it didn't fundamentally require that. And so I think that now we're starting to have those conversations again outside of the public education space, but those conversations need to happen in that time frame in the public education space is where they need to happen. If they can't happen in a public sphere, where can they happen?
I think it's interesting. Two things that you make me think of. One is that Brian, when he was helping with the Butler Act, didn't want it to come out the way it was. First off, he didn't want there to be any penalty on it. He wanted it to mostly just be a nominal law that was kind of making a stance for what the state of Tennessee believed, but he didn't really want it to be a criminal thing, mostly because he didn't want there to be grounds for suing on it. But then also, Brian wasn't against teaching evolution. Brian was against teaching the theory of evolution as a fact. Brian wanted it to be something that you can teach evolution in the classroom, but let's put it in the context. This is a developing scientific theory, and here's the evidence for it. And then we have the Christian, like the fundamentalist Christian view of de novo creation apart from evolution, and he wanted that to also be taught as a theory. Or even not necessarily if it was taught, he just didn't want somebody to come and say, okay, well, evolution is a proven fact, therefore there is no God. Like, that's what he was trying to avoid.
Because that's what was happening. That is what was happening.
In some cases, for sure. But the other thing I think is funny is, like, I got my doctorate of philosophy in genetics and epigenetics. I did not take a single philosophy class. And I think that goes to your point of philosophy is no longer considered, at least for the most part, a viable line of education. I would love to see a philosophy class begin to be taught at the high school level. I would love to see philosophy be a required general education course in college curriculums. Because you're right, we don't know how to have those conversations. We don't even know how to apply logic to arguments in a meaningful way. If we don't even know how to apply logic to arguments in some meaningful way, how on earth are we supposed to gauge what worldview is best? It's not something we're trained to do, and I think that's a massive disservice to all of our kids and to our society as a whole.
I think you're right, and I'm actually really curious to hear your thoughts on something, Jordan. So you had been talking about how the role of public education seems, in your view, to have shifted from being a place to discuss various views that are at the forefront of society to a place where the state sort of decides what to put in the textbook, and then that is the truth, the truth trademarked, the official truth of the system, right? I'm curious what you think about some of in the South, Southern United States, some of the pushes to put Christianity back into the classroom, where at least to me it sort of feels like we're doing the same thing just in the Christian direction now. For example, the placement of the Ten Commandments in all public schools in Texas and in Louisiana. For one, it seems quite forward to require it in every single classroom. And for two, even just as a Christian, personally, I think it's an odd choice to include the Ten Commandments in every classroom, but not, for example, the Beatitudes. It raises theological questions about the role of the law and so on and so forth. I don't want to get too into that, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts as to whether or not that's an improvement or a continuation of the system going in the wrong direction.
Well, I'll clarify that I think that a lot of that is stemming from a retaliation to the current culture. I don't think that it's
You're right.
necessarily, and it's coming from a time now where there is, like you mentioned before, those conversations are starting to open up a lot more, and there doesn't seem to be, that wall is seeming to dissolve slightly between, the religious elements and the secular elements. And so I think they've seen an opening, and they're like, you know what, we have an opening. We are going to take this as a retaliation to everything that's happened over, the last several decades. And to some element, I think that's somewhat fair. I don't necessarily know that I agree with exactly the way that it's being handled, but I do think that the point that they're trying to make is, if we have the opportunity to put the truth of God back into the public education system in some form or fashion that is, recognizable, then we should do that. Not because we, and this is my perspective, not necessarily their perspective. They may say because our religion is right and everybody else's religion is wrong, but more from the element of it is truth. And I think that's the most important element of it. We should put it in there because it's true. We should put it in there because it is right, and it has serious weight, existential weight. It has serious moral weight, and it should be considered. And so I don't think that they're wrong for putting it in. I think that perhaps the motivation from it is a little bit, like I said, retaliatory, and that part I disagree with. But I do think that, and maybe that's not the best step, but I understand why it's happening, right? I completely understand the perspective of where it's coming from, of trying to put a foot in the door and say, okay, well, we're going to at least allow some element of religion back in our schools, because let's be real, like we all just said, that missing is causing problems for our culture. If you truly believe that the Word of God and the law of God is beneficial for preserving us as a society, and you don't put it in your education system, and you have the ability to do so, why? What are you doing? If you truly believe that, if you truly believe that, why would you not, ignore? I say ignore, but go against what societal norms say, and maybe even what some have interpreted the law to say. Why would
Right.
you not put it in there if you believe that it is what is best?
And even if you
Because the
don't,
law should always be what is best.
right, sorry to interrupt. And I was just
Okay.
going to add, even if you don't believe that, the Bible is far and away the most referenced text in all of English writing. And so if you're going to attempt to understand and to interpret English texts throughout the history of English writing, it is very difficult to do that without at least a baseline understanding of Christianity.
Right.
And I would expand this beyond Christianity. I think that we have a phobia in the public schooling system of really giving our kids a meaningful understanding of any religion. And to divorce religion from the necessary educational curriculum of, humans who are being raised in society is just, it's historically ignorant, I think. And I think it makes it very challenging for those kids as they grow up to be able to understand opposing viewpoints, the perspective of people all over the world, to understand the text they're reading throughout history. It's just a necessary part of a complete worldview, even if you don't agree with religion. Just as it's necessary for me to understand the atheist perspective, if I want to, interact with them, it's necessary for everyone, if they want to interact with the past or the present, to understand various religious views.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's part of the issue, I think, too, has been the media has set the tone for what is acceptable to discuss. You know, if we're going to talk about what you have the public sphere, your secular sphere, to talk about religion, and the only other people narrating on our society and our morality for a long time was the media, who removed God from the picture as well, and so it just became this very, I think, very fixed thing. And I don't think, I think it was a very niche. I say niche. I think it was a more narrow field of people than the scope of things would let on. But now that we're here, and now that we see each other a bit more plainly, I won't say that we see each other without a filter, but I think a bit more plainly just because of the world we live in now. I think it's time to open up those conversations of, okay, how are we going to move forward with this? Because we can't just continue to stick our heads in the sand and pretend that God doesn't exist when we get to school. Like, we can't just pretend that the Bible hasn't been the most influential text in world history, bar none. We can't just look at the history of mankind and ignore the single most compelling feature and element and ideology that moved them forward, which is their views on who God is and who they were. And so I think that, like I said, we have to start having that conversation, because I think that the result of what happened from the Scopes trial, and not just the Scopes trial, but from the philosophical and ideological differences, and the war that ensued between them, has left a lot of damage, and we're starting to see that. I say starting to see that. We've been seeing that as a culture and a society. We have to take it. We have to do something, right? We have to finally say, okay, enough is enough. Like, when are we just going to finally, have this conversation and say it's time for us to start talking together? It's time for us as a people, whether we agree or disagree, to have a sphere where we can have those conversations. And hopefully, if we can fix that, the next generation will be able to really piece a lot of things back together.
Well, you know what, Jordan? I am ready to do something. And the reason I say that is because our next episode is actually scheduled to be a roundtable debate. And so you said agree or disagree. I'm leaning towards disagree. So please come back next time, where we'll talk about what the Scopes trial means today, have our best attempt at a roundtable debate, despite the fact that I think we do actually agree on most things. And I hope you'll see us there.
Mm-hmm.